You're listening to a presentation from Calvary Chapel St. Petersburg. For more audio and video content or other information about our church, visit calvarystp.org.
If you have your Bible, make your way to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. I like Philippians a lot because it's like, I'm the oldest in my family, our oldest son. And so the firstborns, you'll know this, always tries to follow the rules. They're normally a little bit better. The further down you go, it's just kind of it's a mix and match. You're not really sure what you're going to get. Thirdborns can be interesting because they're a little spicier sometimes. And the last one is trying to compete with the other two or three. And so I feel like Philippians is written to the firstborn son. They're just like, hey, they're just going with the flow. They're trying to do it. They're listening to Paul. Not like Corinthians, which that's definitely a lastborn son right there, if you were to rank them in children. They're spicy. They're just giving it right back to their parent. They're like, Paul who? He's like, oh, come on now. And so, no, there's a whole thing in that. But the book of Philippians is a church that really likes Paul quite a bit to the point that they sent him a gift. He's in prison, so it's not a good space, so he can't work. And so they sent him a gift, and with this guy named Epaphroditus, who we'll learn about in a couple of weeks. But as they do it, they're really kind of ministering to Paul. And so Paul, in return, sends this letter, this book of Philippians, back to this church in Philippi. This is a church that he had started, very crazy kind of beginnings, if you were, on how this church got off the ground with this woman named Lydia, who was a seller of purple. And she came to faith, and just a very eclectic group of people all gathering together in the church in Philippi. And so Paul's writing this letter. So we find ourselves, though, in chapter 2, and Paul has just told them as a group, hey, let the mindset of Jesus Christ be your mindset. And that is that of humility. So being full of God's presence and his peace and his love, let that really guide how you treat one another. Because as good as the firstborn is, we still got friction and fighting, right? Trying to prove to the other ones that we're the favorite, right? So there's still stuff wrong with us. The rest of the kids don't believe that, right? The other siblings. But there's still things wrong with us. And so I think what Paul's doing here is trying to give them a perspective of how to live together, how to be together. And then after we're done with our text, we're going to share in communion together. So Philippians chapter 2, we're going to pick it up in verse 12. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. So God, as we look at your word this morning, I pray you would teach us, that you would give us insight, Lord, on how not only is the mind of Christ can be in us, how we can be filled with that, but Lord, also as a group that we can work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. So would you continue to do those works in us? In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so a couple points here. The first one is this: work out your salvation. Work out your salvation. So as we start off, Paul's saying, hey, there's something about what God has started in you and continuing in you that he sees that we have responsibility, but also God is doing something in us. So we'll talk about that, working out our salvation. The second point is this: why grumbling hurts. You notice what Paul says. He continues. He goes, hey, God's working in you. It's great, but do everything without grumbling or arguing. Because he knows that's kind of at the base of our hearts. We would want to grumble, and we'll talk about that point. And the third one is this: becoming children of God. One of the really fascinating parts of the Bible is that God invites us into his family. And being part of his family, he calls us children of God. We're adopted, if you will, into what God is not only doing, continuing to do, but that's his heart for us, that we would reflect him and that we become more and more like him. But go to the first point, though, working out your salvation. If you look at verse 12, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Some of the questions really are, what does he mean by work out your salvation? It seems simple enough. Is he talking to the church in Philippi? Is he talking to individuals? What is Paul getting out here. And what does he mean by salvation? I mean, some of us, when we think of salvation, we think of it as a singular point in time that happened. Some people say it was a day or a moment, like, hey, that's when I was saved. Is that what he's talking about? And that's not what I think he's getting at. He believes that salvation is this kind of total experience from the starting spot all the way till it's finished. He views, I believe, all of this is something that we are to work out. That's why he says here, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And I think it might be helpful for us to see that in a larger context. Like I said, there's a tendency, and I'm not sure where it came from, to reduce salvation to kind of a singular moment, to a singular time. Oh, yeah, I did the Christian thing. I joined the club. I haven't done anything with it. But yeah, that was a moment that was years and years ago. But there's no change in my life. It's kind of all the same. And that's how I view my salvation, as a salvation experience. But Paul doesn't view it that way. He believes that since God has started something in us, he's begun that, he's going to continue to work that out through the rest of our life. And so what Paul is doing is encouraging this church in Philippi. You continue to work these things out in fear and trembling, because salvation is not just the one and done starting spot, it was the beginning of a life now with God as it continues to go with him as day by day. So I think what he's getting at here is this total experience of you growing with God, not just a singular moment. And so I think also, too, what Paul is getting at in this particular text, he's talking about this fancy word called sanctification. So what happens is when you become a Christian, you're made right with God. I mean, that's what Lewis says. We talked about it last week. He says something happens in us where we become right with God. That's what it means to have a unity with Jesus Christ. Now, if I'm right with God, now I continue that relationship with him. And in that relationship with him, things in me start to change. And hopefully for the good. Hopefully I do become better at things. I am less grumbling and complaining. I reflect more of his character. So the more I spend time with him, the more I learn about him, and the more that he fills my heart. An illustration here, I got one here. I brought one with me. I always carry it with me as an illustration. It's in my key ring, right? You're like, why do you have so many keys? Don't worry about that. So I have two things on my key ring. I had a couple of years ago, a kid gave me, I was in the hallway, and they gave me this cross that they made. And so I always keep it on my keychain. It's kind of unraveled. It's been about 2-3 years old. I always keep that on there. But that's not what I want to illustrate. I want to illustrate with this. If you don't see what this is, it might be hard to see. This is called a Crunch membership. You're like, Ryan, you don't know what that is. You're right, I don't know what that is. But if you look at my membership card, it's kind of beat up. It looks like I go all the time. And that would be false. I do not. But it looks like that. I got a little barcode in the back. And I was doing this thing. I don't know why I was doing it. People make fun of me all the time about it. I wanted to see how many days I could go without going in to see if I can get a reaction from the guy behind the counter. And sure enough, my wife and I were there. I said, all right, I'm going to break down. You wore me down. I'm going to go down and do this thing. So I go, boop, scans it. The guy, his eyes get really big. He's like, are you kidding me? How many days has it been since you've been here? Like verbally telling me. I'm like, well, this is not helping me to go in. It's not helping me one little bit to go into this thing. And I thought about this because he says to work out your salvation, right? And so, hey, I'm a part of the club. I go to Crunch. I don't look like it, but I do. Not really, I don't. But I could go if I wanted to. And one of the reasons I am supposed to go is I was in a car accident a couple of years ago, and my lower back gets really tight. And so there's this one machine that I go on, right? Not the bench press, obviously. It's just you lay back, and when you lean back, it like kind of stretches your back out. It feels tremendous. Now I don't know why I don't keep going. But what I know is when my back gets really tight and I can't sleep at night, I know that, you know what I should do is go out to the gym and go out there. Now, I'm all prepared. I got a water bottle. I got a towel to wipe the machine down, right? And I go with those little sanitizing wipes from all the sweat that I don't have. I got a towel. I'm ready to go that. I even got a little workout outfit. And so, I mean, I'm ready to go. I'm just go for it. The thing is, though, I sometimes let my back get so tight. I'm like, what am I doing to myself? I should just go. And some people would say, well, Ryan, the problem is it's because it's pretty far away. I mean, yeah, it's about 200 steps from my house. And there is a reason why. It's kind of far. I mean, it can't be any closer. I live like a block away from the Crunch and still like, I just don't have time this week. I don't know. It's not hitting me. But to work those things out, I know take a lot of work and discipline. So I do the back stretch machine. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try these like fancy machines right here, make sure no one's looking. One time, though, I was surprised because I do see people at Calvary in there all the time. And they're like, hey. I'm like, hey. I know you're surprised that I'm here. Surprise. You look like you come. I don't really. But one time I was there, I have my oldest is 18, and so I'm like doing this like machine. I'm sitting there, I'm like just, get my technique proper or whatever I'm doing. It's me, that's why I don't use free weights. And like I'm there, you never know who you're gonna see. Then my son just walks out of nowhere, like just stares at me. I'm like, yes? I'm like, all right, you work out here, I'm gonna go home. All right, I'm done for the day, all right? It's embarrassing enough I'm doing it in front of other people, but my own kids are like, yeah, you can knock yourself out. You not have fun out here, I'm done. Because he goes with his friends, and I'm like, I'm good. But what I know is working out, though, is a lot of discipline. Not only that, doing it daily, something will happen. So one of the things, when I was in that car accident, too, one of the things that they said that I needed to do was physical therapy. Now, I was talking with a friend of mine about physical therapy. He's like, I don't believe in physical therapy, because if it doesn't work, they're not going to give me a refund. And I'm like, I don't think that's how it works. Like, you don't do it and they give you a refund if it didn't work. But one of the things about physical therapy that's important to know is like what they're doing is they want to work the area that's the problem. Right? And I'm like, yes, my whole body's the problem. It's going to take a while to fix that. I understand. But nonetheless, though, I had this bulging disc in my back. And what they do is they make you do these like weird exercises. You're like, is this even a thing? I don't even know what I'm doing right now. Am I doing this right? I feel like I'm doing this wrong. Can somebody please see this? Like, I can only imagine what I look like doing these exercises for my lower back. It looks so odd. And somebody like, here, just a little bit higher. I'm like, okay, all right, I'm out. It's kind of crazy what we're doing. But what you do is the purpose, now I'm not a physical therapist, so I'm making this up, but I think the purpose of what they're trying to tell you is you do the work to strengthen the muscles and the rest of it to help regrow or to help the thing that's been injured. And so I think about this idea when Paul says, hey, work out your salvation. It does take time, it does take discipline, right? You do need to sanitize your machine when you leave. There's some things that you need to do. And listen, I saw you crunch people. You don't sanitize the machine when you leave. I'm like, I ain't touching that. It's all gross over there. Another reason why I don't go. But what I see, though, is that part of what Paul is getting at is this idea of working out your salvation with fear and trembling. Because he knows that because salvation is just not the singular moment that just happened, that it's a lifelong journey with God. Yes, it is the moment that it happened, but it doesn't end there. You might remember the rotisserie guy, set it and forget it. That's not Christianity. You set anything and forget it, it's going to break. You just can't let you can't let the food in there forever. You eventually got to do something with it. The idea, though, is that you are constantly growing based out of what? You're working that thing out in your life. And as you start to work those things out, what happens? God actually works in you. Now, this might be complicated, though. If you look at the verse, you're like, well, okay, how much of it's on me and how much of it's on God, right? Because that's what it's saying. Verse 12 says, you work out your salvation with fear and trembling, but then verse 13 says, for it is God who works in you. Well, which one is it? Well, listen to Lewis on this. He says this. The Bible really seems to clinch the matter when it puts the two things together into one amazing sentence. The first half is, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, which looks as if everything depends on us in our good actions. But the second half goes, for it is God who works in you, which looks as if God did everything and we nothing. I'm afraid that this sort of thing we come up against in Christianity. I am puzzled, but I am not surprised. You see, we are now trying to understand how to separate into watertight compartments what exactly God does and what man does when God and man are working together. What Lewis says is right. We should be puzzled but not surprised. God is working in me as I'm working at the same time. And that's kind of amazing, right? That's how I wish it would work at the gym. God, just build those muscles, right? I'll just do a couple reps, it's over. He's like, no. My working in life is me making decisions, me participating as a child of God. At the same time, God's doing something in me. Let me illustrate this with a verse that Paul tells his other favorite church, the church of Corinth. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And this grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. See, Paul carries this tension throughout the Bible. It is God's work in me. At the same time, I'm working. And I worked harder than everybody. But it's also God's grace in me. See, when you put those things together, which might not seem like they go together, right? If it all was on you, my gosh, I wouldn't want to get up tomorrow if it was all on me. If it was all on God, right? What motivation is there for me to work? See, it's what the scriptures teach. God is working in you. At the same time is you work out your salvation. You work out that day-to-day process of growing and knowing God. Now, all of this is headed somewhere because what Paul is going to do here at the end of the verses, he's going to talk about how he has been working these things out in his own life. If you jump down in the verses, it says, Verse 17, but even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. What Paul's just saying is, listen, I'm not asking you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. I'm telling you what I do. I'm telling you that it's God working in me. At the same time, I'm working it out. And I am like a drink offering being poured out on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith. I'm committed to you. And he goes, I rejoice, and I pray that you would rejoice also with me. What Paul is trying to have them see is that he's just not asking them to do this. It's something that he himself is doing. He's pouring himself out. And as he's doing that, he finds tremendous joy. And this is kind of amazing that Paul, as he starts to work on this, and for 2 Timothy 4:6, it says, for I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. Paul is trying to show and model what it means to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, at the same time, God working in us, which both go together. But it gets to my second point, though, which is the problem. Why do we grumble? Now, grumbling's fun, I will admit. It's grumbling because it's grumbling, and the idea of grumbling is to mutter under a low and suppressed discourse, which means it's you muttering to yourself. You know, when somebody says, what'd you say? I didn't say anything. That's a grumble, okay? Because you said something. I know you said something. What? You didn't hear it, didn't exist. Okay, I see how it is. It's that low tone in your voice that you grumble, you roll your eyes. It's some type of way of saying, oh my gosh, I got to deal with this dummy, right? But what happens is, what Paul is getting at is that, as he says here, find the verse, do everything without grumbling or arguing. He's talking to the church in Philippi, but this is in correlation to them growing in their salvation. He goes, hey, I want you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling before God. Don't grumble or argue. Now, why would he say that? Why would he say that? Well, you shouldn't grumble and argue, obviously, but there's a bigger picture that Paul's getting at. When he refers to grumbling, this is something that's very familiar in the Old Testament and something the people of Israel did quite a bit. In particular, I'm going to read you this verse in Corinthians. If you have your Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I think it's great. Because remember, this is like the third child or the last child. Paul's writing to the church in Corinth, chapter 10. And what he wants to do for them is help them to have insight by using the example of Israel to help them know how to continue to walk out their faith. Okay? So he's using Israel as a backdrop on how to walk out their faith. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, now these things occurred, okay? These things. Paul's giving them as an example. Like, hey, don't be like Israel. Don't do what they did. You are God's children. You're part of God's family. You do it right. Don't be like them. And this is the encouragement that he gives. Now, these things occurred, chapter 10, verse 6, as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. You're like, oh, okay. This is a good example. I don't want to put my heart on evil things. So do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. That's not good. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will provide a way out so that you can endure it. Did you hear what he's saying here? He goes, yeah, there were people that were grumbling and a destroying angel killed them all. Oh, there was people doing this and they that. Why? Because instead of working out their faith, right? Because salvation, by faith, God justifies me, and I'm continuing my relationship with him. Instead of them working out their faith, what did they do? They murmured at God. Yeah, some God you are. You got us lost out here in the desert. My wife can't even do that. Look at you. How'd you beat her, right? I mean, you see what I'm saying? They're just grumbling to him. Like, I'd rather just die. You should have just let it die in Egypt. Just why did you even bother with all of us? Now, they said it so loud, and they started blaming Moses and Aaron. Like, who are these two knuckleheads you picked? Couldn't you found somebody better? And so they're just complaining and complaining. These are supposed to be God's covenant, faithful people that he's working with, and they're just like, this is all your fault. If we had a different God, a better one, Why don't we make one out of gold? That'll get us. He's like, oh my gosh, I picked the wrong group, did I not? No, he didn't. He loved them. He put his name on them. And what Paul is doing is using them as a backdrop on what grumbling looks like. Because why? Because what Paul is doing, and be careful, what Paul is doing is he's saying, you church are representative of a holy people to God. Like Israel, they failed the test a lot of times. But now you have the same opportunity they did. Will you pass the test? Will you walk with him? I mean, you think about it. It's so funny. When you read the Old Testament, you're like, knuckleheads, why'd you do that? I wouldn't have done that. And God's like, oh, really? Let's try it on you. What would you do in that situation? Well, let's not get personal here, God, right? And when you read that, he says, those are actually examples because that's your present. What will you do? Now, in the story of talking about grumbling, there is a very particular story that deals with it quite a bit. Exodus 16, I'll read it. Exodus 16, verse 1, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin. That's a name. Which is between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. As he says in our text here, do not grumble. Right, what he said? Yeah, do not grumble. So they did, though. They're like, we got to grumble. Who are we going to grumble against? Moses, obviously. So they do. The Israelites said to them, if we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, we sat around pots of meat and all had food we wanted. But you brought us out in the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. And this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they are to bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other day. So prepare for the Sabbath by bringing more on the day before. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord because he has heard your grumbling against him. So they're grumbling against Moses, but who God says, they're really grumbling against me. You don't trust me. In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and the bread that you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And grumbling, this muttering, which is just saying, God, I don't trust your process. I don't trust what you're doing. I'd rather just do it differently. When realize that as they grumbled against him, what did God do? He was testing them. He was testing them to see really what was in them. Hey, do you trust me or not? And what did he provided food for them? But in their heart, they said, you know what? We're not interested in all what you're doing here, God. We'd rather have been slaves and captives, being mistreated. At least we had meat to eat. What happens is in grumbling, you can rationalize a million different ways of how it could have been better. You can rationalize a million different ways. Well, if you would have said it like this or with this tone, if you would have done this, then my response would have been different. But what Paul is getting at here, he says to them as a church, he goes, you need to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And when you work out your salvation, don't grumble or argue. Because what? So that, verse 15, you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. That's the third point. What does Paul want for this church? For them to be children of God. So like Israel failed the test, we have an opportunity every day to pass the test because the test is presented to us. And just as Israel was a group of people that God loved and cherished, we're a group of people that God loves and cherishes. So in some way, we're like Israel. Will we succeed? Will we follow him? Will we reject him? Or will we give in to temptation? One of the things we talked about last week is the reason that you can stand under temptation is becoming full of something so much that when that thing comes along, there's no need, there's no urge that you even want to do that. Now, I will say, in the 4 or 5 times that I worked out, when I did it and I stretched my back, it felt good to the point that I could sleep better at night. I'm like, coincidence couldn't have happened, right? No, I really think that by listening to people tell me that this is how your body works, and I think I know how my body works, but I don't, that it would actually benefit me. Yeah, does you got to go and you got to walk the 200 steps to the place? Yeah, you got to do all that kind of stuff. But when I went, something happened. There was transformation in me to the point that, you know what, my back doesn't hurt as bad anymore, right? Anecdotal experience, my own, but that's what happened. What I'm saying is by choosing to work out something, the pain point that I had wasn't as big of a deal anymore. Another thing I noticed by being full is that you constantly aren't looking to be filled. A lot of people, what happens in temptation and why we grumble is because we want to be filled with something so desperately that when that thing doesn't meet our need, we get real saucy. And saucy might not be, that's the polite word. We get real saucy and we grumble and we argue.